War I is often remembered through sepia photographs of young men in uniforms, through poetry about poppies and sacrifice, through the idea that it was a tragic but noble conflict that changed the world. That image is not entirely wrong, but it is incomplete. Beneath the monuments and the ceremonies, beneath the language of duty and honor, there existed a parallel war that was rarely photographed, rarely discussed, and almost never taught. This was a war where certain practices, certain realities became so common that they stopped being remarkable. Soldiers stopped writing home about them, officers stopped reporting them, governments stopped investigating them. What began as exceptions became procedures. What began as emergencies became policy. And what began as unthinkable became, over 4 years of industrialized slaughter, disturbingly normal. When we think about what was disturbing in World War I, we often think about the scale of death, the mechanical nature of killing, the introduction of poison gas, or the churning wasteland of no man's land. These are the stories that have been told. But there were other practices, quieter ones, that reveal something more unsettling about how human beings adapt to sustained horror. These were not the dramatic atrocities that make headlines. These were the bureaucratic accommodations, the medical compromises, the psychological denials that allowed the war to continue long after it should have collapsed under its own weight. This is not a story about evil. This is a story about normalization. The first thing that became normal was the smell. Every soldier who spent time in the trenches wrote about it in their early letters, tried to describe it, tried to make sense of it, but after a few months, the letters stopped mentioning it. The smell of the Western Front was not a single odor, but a layered assault that varied by season, by weather, by proximity to recent shelling. It combined human waste, decaying sandbags, poison gas residue, chloride of lime, tobacco smoke, wet wool, and above all the smell of decomposition. Bodies were everywhere in the trench systems. Some were buried in the trench walls themselves, used as structural reinforcement when the parapets collapsed. Some were in no man's land, too dangerous to retrieve. Some were under duckboards, beneath the muddy water that filled the trench floors, surfacing when the ground shifted. The smell became so constant that soldiers stopped registering it consciously. It simply became the smell of the war, the smell of France, the smell of normal. New replacements would gag and vomit for their first few days. Veterans would watch them with neither sympathy nor contempt, just a kind of empty patience, knowing the smell would soon disappear for them too, not because it went away, but because their brains would stop processing it as abnormal. The normalization of that smell was a small thing, a sensory adaptation, but it reflected something larger. It reflected the speed with which the unacceptable became unremarkable. In the first months of the war, when the trenches were still thought to be temporary, there were procedures for the dignified recovery of the dead, for proper burial, for recording locations and identities. By 1916, there were sectors of the line where it was understood that bodies would remain where they fell, possibly forever. Chaplains stopped holding services for every casualty. Burial details were assigned only when decomposition presented a sanitation risk. The dead became part of the landscape, and the landscape became normal. Rats became normal. Not the presence of rats, which was expected in any military camp, but the size of them, the boldness of them, the sheer number of them. Trench rats grew enormous, fed on human remains and unlimited food supplies from rations and dumps. They were described as being the size of cats, and this was not an exaggeration. They would crawl over sleeping men, bite the faces of the wounded, chew through supply bags, and spread disease. Soldiers developed elaborate methods to kill them. They would stab them with bayonets, crush them with clubs, set traps, poison bait stations. Some units organized rat hunts as a form of entertainment. The nightly kill counts were discussed like sports scores, and yet the rats never diminished. For every 100 killed, 1,000 remained. Eventually, soldiers stopped trying. The rats simply became another feature of trench life, like mud or lice, something to be endured rather than resisted. Men learned to sleep with rats crawling over them. They learned to eat with rats, watching inches away. They learned to ignore the scratching sounds in the walls, the squeaking in the dark, the occasional sharp pain of a bite during the night. The rats became normal. Lice became normal. Every man in the trenches had lice. This was not a condition of poor hygiene or individual misfortune. It was a universal constant. The body louse, Pediculus humanus corporis, thrived in the woolen uniforms, in the seams and folds where body heat concentrated, where they could lay eggs by the hundreds. The itching was maddening at first, relentless, impossible to ignore. Soldiers would scratch themselves bloody, would strip off their uniforms in freezing weather to try to pick out the insects by hand, would run candle flames along the seams to kill the eggs. Nothing worked. The lice always returned. Field hygiene stations offered delousing procedures where uniforms were baked in high heat ovens. But by the time a soldier returned to the line, he would be reinfested within hours, from contact with other men, from contaminated dugouts, from the environment itself. Eventually the scratching became unconscious, automatic. Men would scratch while eating, while standing watch, while sleeping, their fingernails wearing grooves into their own skin. The constant irritation, the lack of sleep from itching, the low-grade infections from scratched skin, all became baseline conditions. No one mentioned lice in official reports. They were beneath notice, a discomfort so universal, it ceased to qualify as a complaint. Trench foot became normal. In the early months of the war, trench foot was treated as a medical emergency, a sign of command failure, evidence of inadequate attention to soldier welfare. By 1916, it was regarded as inevitable. Trench foot was caused by prolonged exposure to cold, wet conditions, usually from standing in waterlogged trenches for days or weeks at a time. The feet would swell, turn white or purple, lose sensation, develop open sores and gangrene. Severe cases required amputation. In the beginning, officers who allowed their men to develop trench foot faced courts-martial for negligence. But as the war continued, as the trench systems became permanent, as the water table rose and drainage became impossible, trench foot became so common that it was treated as a normal seasonal affliction, like influenza. Medical officers established quotas, acceptable percentages of trench foot cases that would not trigger investigations. Units rotated out of the line not to prevent trench foot entirely, but to keep it within manageable levels. Soldiers were ordered to change their socks regularly, to dry their feet when possible, to apply whale oil to their skin. These measures helped, but they could not eliminate the problem, because the problem was the trenches themselves, and the trenches were not going away. So trench foot became a cost of doing business, a predictable loss factor, something to be documented and managed rather than prevented. Men learned to recognize the early signs, the numbness, the discoloration. They knew what was coming. They kept fighting anyway. Shell shock became normal. In the first years of the war, shell shock was not well understood. It presented as a constellation of symptoms: tremors, paralysis, muteness, blindness, deafness, nightmares, amnesia, emotional collapse, all occurring without visible physical injury. Early medical opinion treated it as a form of concussion, caused by the physical impact of shell explosions on the nervous system, hence the term shell shock. Soldiers who exhibited these symptoms were evacuated to hospitals, treated with rest and reassurance, and often returned to duty. But as the war continued, the number of shell shock cases exploded. Hospitals in Britain filled with men who shook uncontrollably, who could not speak, who screamed in their sleep, who stared at nothing for hours. The medical establishment began to suspect that many of these cases were not caused by physical trauma at all, but by psychological breakdown, by the sheer accumulated stress of industrialized combat. This suspicion created a crisis. If shell shock was psychological, then it was potentially voluntary, a form of cowardice, a failure of moral character. The military could not afford to evacuate every man who claimed to be mentally unable to continue. The diagnostic criteria became stricter. The treatments became harsher. Men were sent back to the front more quickly, sometimes without any treatment at all. Electric shock therapy was used, not to heal, but to make remaining in the hospital more unpleasant than returning to combat. Officers lectured shell-shock patients about duty, about letting down their comrades, about the shame they were bringing to their families. Some men were court-martialed and executed for cowardice, their shell-shock symptoms disregarded as malingering. The phrase itself, shell-shock, began to be used less frequently in official documents, replaced by terms like neurasthenia or battle fatigue or simply nervous breakdown, terms that carried less implication of a wound and more implication of a weakness. By 1917, the medical services had developed a system for managing shell shock that prioritized military efficiency over patient welfare. Men were assessed not for whether they were genuinely ill, but for whether they could be made functional enough to return to duty. The vast majority were. Shell shock did not go away, but the willingness to acknowledge it, to treat it as a legitimate injury, diminished until it became just another category of wastage, another line item in casualty reports, another normal feature of industrial war. Self-inflicted wounds became normal. From the beginning of the war, there were soldiers who injured themselves deliberately to escape the front. A bullet through the foot, a hand placed on a parapet during shelling, an infected wound deliberately aggravated. These were capital offenses, punishable by execution after court-martial. But as the war dragged on, as units were ground down and rebuilt and ground down again, as the certainty of death or mutilation became statistically overwhelming, the number of self-inflicted wounds increased. Medical officers learned to recognize them, the characteristic angle of a gunshot wound, the too convenient location, the lack of accompanying injuries. Some self-inflicted wounds were obvious, even defiant. A man shooting himself in front of witnesses, daring the army to execute him because execution was faster than the trenches. Others were more subtle, disguised as accidents, plausibly deniable. The military response was inconsistent. Some officers prosecuted every suspected case. Others quietly looked away, understanding that a unit pushed beyond its limits would break in one way or another, and a few self-inflicted wounds were preferable to mass refusal or mutiny. Courts-martial records show hundreds of executions for self-inflicted wounds, but they also show thousands of cases where no charges were filed, where the injury was recorded as accidental, where everyone involved understood the truth but chose not to speak it. The practice became an open secret, a grim calculus that individual soldiers performed in private, weighing the risk of execution against the certainty of remaining in the line. It became normal not because it was accepted, but because it was so common that suppressing it entirely would have required executing thousands of men. And even the military bureaucracy recognized that such a slaughter of its own troops would undermine morale more than the practice itself. So self-inflicted wounds existed in a gray zone, officially forbidden, sporadically punished, quietly tolerated, and understood by everyone to be a predictable response to conditions that no human being was designed to endure. Drinking contaminated water became normal. The trench systems had no running water, no plumbing, no sanitation infrastructure. Water was brought forward in cans, in petrol tins that still smelled of fuel, in whatever containers could be found. It came from shell holes, from puddles, from streams that ran through decomposing battlefields. It was chemically treated with chlorine or iodine, but treatment could not remove all pathogens, and it could not remove the taste of death, the faint sweetness that soldiers learned to associate with water that had been in contact with corpses. Dysentery was endemic. Typhoid was common. Cholera appeared periodically. Men drank the water anyway because there was no alternative. They drank it knowing it might kill them, calculating that dehydration would kill them faster. They learned to strain it through cloth, to let the sediment settle, to add extra purification chemicals, but these were marginal improvements. The water was bad, and everyone knew it, and everyone drank it anyway. Official reports tracked waterborne illness rates the way they tracked ammunition expenditure, as a resource management problem, a logistical challenge to be optimized but never solved. Soldiers stopped complaining about the water. Complaining accomplished nothing. The water became normal. Eating among corpses became normal. Supply trains brought food forward to the trenches, but there was nowhere clean to prepare it, nowhere clean to eat it. Cooking fires attracted enemy artillery. Dugouts were contaminated with mud and waste and the residue of previous occupants. Men ate standing in trenches where bodies were embedded in the walls, where hands or boots protruded from the earth, where the smell of decay was inescapable. They learned to eat mechanically without thinking about the context, to focus on the food itself and ignore everything surrounding it. They ate bully beef and hardtack, jam and biscuits, tinned vegetables and tea, sometimes hot, often cold, always with the taste of the trench in their mouths, the dust and the chemical smell and the underlying wrongness. They ate while rats watched. They ate while under intermittent shelling. They ate while their friends lay wounded nearby, while burial parties worked a few yards away, while snipers fired at shadows. Food became purely functional, a source of calories, a brief interruption in the routine of survival. The rituals of eating, the social aspects, the pleasure of a meal, eroded until eating was just another task to complete, another box to check before the next watch, the next raid, the next bombardment. Eating among corpses became normal, executing deserters became normal. Military law in all the combatant nations included the death penalty for desertion, cowardice in the face of the enemy, and similar offenses against discipline. In peacetime, these laws were rarely invoked. In the first months of the war, they were applied sparingly, with extensive review procedures and frequent commutations. But as the war continued, as the tactical situation stabilized into static trench warfare, as the initial patriotic enthusiasm faded and was replaced by exhaustion and despair, the number of men who attempted to desert increased. The military response was to increase the use of capital punishment. The British Army executed 306 soldiers during World War I, most for desertion. The French executed at least 600, though the true number may be higher. The German and Austro-Hungarian armies executed thousands. These executions were not hidden. They were carried out in front of assembled units, intended as deterrents, as object lessons. The condemned man would be tied to a post, blindfolded, shot by a firing squad drawn from his own comrades. Sometimes the initial volley did not kill him. An officer would administer a final shot to the head. The body would be left on display for a period before burial. The man's name would be read aloud as an example of what happened to cowards and traitors. And then the unit would return to duty and the war would continue. These executions became routine, scheduled, bureaucratic. Forms were filled out. Chaplains attended. Medical officers certified death. The executed men were recorded in casualty lists, usually without mention of the cause of death, so that their families would receive death notifications identical to those of men killed by the enemy. The practice was controversial even at the time. Some officers refused to convene courts-martial, believing that men driven to desertion by shell shock or unbearable conditions should not be executed. Other officers believed that harsh discipline was necessary to maintain order in the face of sustained horror, that without the threat of execution, entire units would collapse. Both perspectives coexisted within the same armies, sometimes within the same divisions. What was not controversial, what was simply accepted, was that executions would happen regularly as part of the machinery of discipline, as normal as drills or inspections or casualty reports. Executing deserters became normal. Living in darkness became normal. The trenches were lit only by necessity, only by the bare minimum required for essential tasks. Fires attracted artillery. Electric lights, in the few places they existed, were kept dim and shielded. Flares illuminated no man's land periodically, casting stark shadows, freezing movement, but inside the trenches themselves, darkness was the default state. Men learned to navigate by touch, by memory, by the faint ambient light of distant explosions. They learned to recognize other men by voice, by silhouette, by the sound of their footsteps on duckboards. They lived nocturnally, moving mostly at night when observation was reduced, sleeping during the day in whatever dark corner of a dugout they could claim. This reversal of normal circadian rhythms, combined with the chronic sleep deprivation caused by constant alertness requirements, created a kind of permanent twilight state, neither fully awake nor fully asleep, a grey exhaustion that blurred days into weeks, into months. Soldiers lost track of time. They forgot what day it was, what month, sometimes even what year. The war became a single continuous present, measured not by calendars but by tours in the line, by rotations in and out, by the gaps where men used to be. Living in darkness became normal. Chronic pain became normal. Almost every man in the trenches was in pain almost all the time. Pain from old wounds that had healed badly. Pain from current wounds deemed too minor to warrant evacuation. Pain from infections, from abscesses, from dental problems, from hernias, from joint damage, from back injuries sustained carrying heavy loads over broken ground. Pain from malnutrition, from vitamin deficiencies that cause scurvy and beriberi. Pain from exposure, from frostbite, from trench fever, from influenza. Pain from exhaustion, from muscles strained beyond their limits. Medical services focused on acute injuries, on wounds that required immediate surgery, on conditions that threatened life or made a man unable to fight. Chronic pain that did not impair function was largely ignored. Men were expected to continue their duties while in pain, and they did. They learned to compartmentalize it, to function through it, to save their limited access to medical care for emergencies. Aspirin was sometimes available, but it was rationed, saved for severe cases. Alcohol helped when it could be obtained, and soldiers traded anything for extra rum rations, for looted wine, for anything that dulled sensation. Morphine existed, but it was reserved for the seriously wounded, for men dying in aid stations. The vast majority of soldiers simply lived with pain, constant and unrelenting, until pain became the baseline and the absence of pain became unimaginable. Chronic pain became normal. Hallucinations became normal. Extended sleep deprivation, malnutrition, stress, exposure to toxins, traumatic brain injuries, and the sheer psychological weight of sustained combat all contributed to altered states of consciousness. Men saw things that were not there, heard voices, experienced time distortions. They saw dead friends standing in the trench beside them. They heard phantom artillery bombardments in moments of silence. They smelled gas when no gas was present. These experiences were common enough that soldiers had their own terminology for them, names that acknowledged the phenomena without pathologizing them. They understood implicitly that everyone experienced these distortions to some degree, that it was a natural consequence of the conditions, not a sign of mental illness. Medical officers were aware of the problem but had no effective treatment and no practical way to evacuate every man who reported hallucinations. The symptoms were logged if they seemed severe, ignored if they seemed minor, and generally regarded as another cost of operating at the limits of human endurance. Soldiers learned to reality test their perceptions, to verify with others whether what they were experiencing was shared, to trust their comrades' observations over their own when the two conflicted. They learned to function while uncertain whether their senses were reliable. Hallucinations became normal. Urinating and defecating in public became normal. There were no private facilities in the frontline trenches, no toilets, no latrines in the civilian sense. Sanitation systems were improvised, usually consisting of buckets or designated areas that were emptied periodically, when possible. But during active fighting, during bombardments, during any period when movement was restricted, men relieved themselves wherever they stood, in corners of the trench, into empty tins, onto the ground. There was no privacy, no dignity, no choice. Human waste accumulated in the trenches, adding to the contamination, to the smell, to the disease burden. Soldiers stopped feeling embarrassment. Embarrassment required a context of normalcy that no longer existed. They performed bodily functions in front of each other, among each other, without comment or reaction, because there was no alternative, and because everyone else was doing the same. The social conventions that govern private behavior in civilian life simply dissolved, replaced by a kind of enforced intimacy where every physical vulnerability was visible and unremarkable. Urinating and defecating in public became normal. Watching men burn to death became normal. Flame weapons were introduced during World War I. Flamethrowers that projected ignited fuel dozens of meters, creating casualties that were both physically devastating and psychologically horrifying. Men caught by flamethrowers burned alive, their uniforms and skin igniting, their screams cutting through battlefield noise. Other soldiers watched, unable to help, unable to look away. They watched men burn in disabled tanks, trapped inside metal boxes that became ovens. They watched fuel dumps explode, immolating anyone nearby. They watched buildings collapse in flames, phosphorus shells burst in white-hot chemical fires that could not be extinguished with water. The first few times a soldier saw someone burned to death, it marked him. It appeared in his letters home, in his nightmares, in his conscious thoughts. But after repeated exposure, the psychological impact faded. Burning became just another way to die, neither more nor less terrible than the many other ways to die that occurred daily. Soldiers developed black humor about it, the smell of burning flesh described as resembling cooked pork, a comparison that made eating rations more difficult for those who made it. They learned to shoot burning men as an act of mercy, to end the suffering more quickly. They learned to keep fighting while men burned nearby, to ignore the screams, to focus on their own survival. Watching men burn to death became normal. Friendly fire became normal. In the chaos of modern combat, with long-range artillery, with poor communications, with units intermingled and positions uncertain, soldiers were frequently killed by their own side. Artillery fell short, hitting friendly trenches instead of enemy ones. Aircraft bombed the wrong coordinates. Patrols fired on each other in the dark. Attacking units advanced into their own creeping barrage and were shredded by their own shells. The official response to friendly fire casualties was complicated. They were undeniably losses, but they could not be blamed on the enemy, and acknowledging them too openly risked undermining confidence in commanders and in the artillery support that infantry depended on. So friendly fire deaths were usually recorded in the same category as enemy casualties, killed in action, with no distinction made. Survivors knew the truth. They knew that a significant percentage of casualties, estimates ranged from 5 to 15% depending on the situation, were caused by their own side. They accepted this as an inevitable consequence of the scale and complexity of industrial warfare as a cost of fire support. Protests accomplished nothing. The artillery was too far back to see what it was hitting. The officers planning barrages were working from maps that were often inaccurate or outdated. The men in the trenches simply endured, taking cover from their own shells the same way they took cover from enemy shells, knowing that both could kill them just as easily. Friendly fire became normal. Sleeping next to the dying became normal. Aid stations and field hospitals were overwhelmed. Casualty clearing procedures were slow, and during major offensives, wounded men could wait hours or days before evacuation. In the meantime, they lay in trenches, in dugouts, in shell holes, wherever they had fallen or been dragged to relative safety. Men with minor wounds continued their duties, sleeping in the same spaces as men with mortal wounds, listening to them die through the night. The slow, ragged breathing, the occasional cry for water or for mother, the eventual silence. There was nothing to be done. Medical personnel were focused on those who could be saved, who might return to duty. The clearly dying received morphine if it was available, received rough comfort if someone had time, but mostly they died alone, surrounded by other men who were too exhausted or too numb to provide more than token acknowledgement. Soldiers learned to sleep through the sounds of dying, the way they learned to sleep through shelling, through their own discomfort, through everything. They learned to wake in the morning and check who was still breathing, to report the dead to the sergeant, to move the bodies when ordered, and then to continue with the day's tasks. Sleeping next to the dying became normal. Looting corpses became normal. Dead men had no use for their possessions, and living men needed everything they could get. Official policy stated that personal effects of the dead were to be collected and returned to next of kin, that valuables were to be turned in. that military equipment was to be salvaged and redistributed. In practice, these rules were enforced selectively, or not at all. Soldiers routinely took anything useful from corpses: boots, socks, cigarettes, food, weapons, tools, watches, letters, photographs, money. They took from their own dead and from enemy dead, without meaningful distinction. This was not considered dishonor to the deceased. It was considered practical. The dead were beyond needing anything, and the living needed everything. Officers sometimes participated, sometimes looked away, sometimes took a share for themselves. Looting corpses became an accepted part of battlefield salvage, an unofficial supply system that supplemented the official one. Men who might have been horrified by the practice in civilian life did it without hesitation after a few weeks in the trenches, because hesitation meant going without things that made survival slightly more bearable. Looting corpses became normal. Leaving the wounded became normal. Doctrine stated that wounded men should be recovered as quickly as possible, that stretcher bearers should operate continuously, that no wounded would be abandoned. Reality was different. No man's land was often impossible to cross under fire. Wounded men who fell between the trenches during attacks might lie there for hours, for days, crying for help that could not come without risking more casualties. Soldiers learned to ignore those cries, to stop listening, because listening and being unable to help was worse than not listening at all. Wounded men learned that if they fell in the wrong place, they would die there, and they made their peace with it in advance, carrying extra ammunition instead of field dressings, planning to fight until they were killed rather than lying helpless in the mud waiting for death. Stretcher bearers did heroic work, but there were never enough of them, and they were vulnerable, frequently killed or wounded themselves while trying to reach casualties. The calculus became brutal. Lightly wounded men who could walk made their own way back. Seriously wounded men in relatively safe locations would be recovered when possible. Wounded men in exposed positions were considered lost unless a major operation could be organized, and major operations to recover the wounded could not be justified when they might produce more wounded. Officers stopped promising soldiers that they would not be left behind, because that promise could not be kept. Leaving the wounded became normal. Mutilating enemy dead became normal. Official policy in all armies prohibited abuse of enemy corpses, required decent treatment of the dead, threatened punishment for violations. These policies were widely ignored. Soldiers took souvenirs from enemy corpses: helmets, insignia, personal items, sometimes body parts, teeth or fingers or ears. They posed for photographs with dead enemies, arranged corpses in mocking positions, displayed bodies as trophies or warnings. They urinated on enemy dead, disfigured faces, destroyed identification. The motivations were complex: part revenge for dead comrades, part psychological distance creation, part dehumanization that made killing easier, part simple brutalization, the erosion of moral constraints that occurred after prolonged exposure to violence. Officers knew it happened. Chaplains condemned it. It happened anyway. Mostly unpunished, mostly unacknowledged in official records. The practice varied by unit, by commander, by individual psychology, but it was common enough that every army had to confront the fact that its soldiers were doing things that would be considered war crimes by later standards, and every army responded by largely looking away, by maintaining public fiction of civilized warfare, while privately acknowledging that the men in the trenches had passed beyond the reach of peacetime morality. Mutilating enemy dead became normal. Lying to the wounded became normal. Medical personnel, stretcher bearers, officers, even fellow soldiers routinely lied to wounded men about the severity of their injuries. A man with a sucking chest wound would be told he would be fine, would be back with the unit soon. A man with both legs shattered beyond repair would be told the surgeons would fix him up. A man with an abdominal wound that was clearly mortal would be assured that he was going to make it. These lies were told kindly, meant to comfort, meant to prevent panic, meant to let a man die without terror. They were also told practically because panicked wounded men required more resources, more personnel, more time to manage. The wounded often knew they were being lied to, recognized the tone, the evasions, the false optimism, but they participated in the fiction anyway, accepting the comfort even when they understood it was false, because false hope was better than certain despair. Soldiers learned to deliver these lies convincingly, to say the right words, to project confidence they did not feel. They learned that kindness sometimes meant deception, that truth was not always the highest value when a man was dying in pain and fear. Lying to the wounded became normal. Going days without sleep became normal. Combat operations did not stop for human circadian rhythms. Attacks happened at all hours. Defenses had to be manned continuously. Soldiers stood watch for hours in the dark, stood to at dawn, performed labor during the day, stood watch again at night, participated in raids or patrols, endured bombardments that made sleep impossible, and survived on fragments of rest grabbed whenever possible. 20 minutes in a dugout, an hour slumped against a trench wall. Never deep sleep, never restorative, always interrupted. The cumulative effects of chronic sleep deprivation were severe and universal. Cognitive function declined. Judgment became impaired. Reaction time slowed. Men fell asleep standing up, while marching, sometimes while under fire. They entered fugue states, continued to function mechanically while unconscious of their actions, woke with no memory of the previous hours. Medical officers documented the problem but had no solution. The operational requirements could not be reduced. The number of men available to meet those requirements was fixed or declining. So soldiers simply operated in a state of permanent exhaustion, their bodies pushed beyond sustainable limits, surviving on adrenaline, caffeine, tobacco, and the simple animal will to live. Going days without sleep became normal. Losing your hearing became normal. Artillery bombardments produced noise levels that exceeded the human threshold for permanent hearing damage, sounds so loud they caused not just pain, but physical trauma to the inner ear, rupturing eardrums, destroying the delicate bones and nerves that enable hearing. Every soldier who spent significant time under bombardment suffered hearing loss to some degree. Some went completely deaf. Others lost the ability to hear specific frequencies, could no longer understand speech, lived with constant tinnitus, a ringing or roaring that never stopped. There was no effective treatment. Hearing damage was permanent. Medical officers documented it, but there was no disability discharge for partial deafness, no exemption from duty. Men who could still follow orders visually, who could still operate a rifle, were considered fit for service regardless of hearing loss. They communicated through shouting, through exaggerated gestures, through written notes. They learned to read lips, to guess at words they could not hear, to function in a world of muffled, distorted sound. Their fellow soldiers adapted, learned who was deaf, learned to get their attention before speaking, learned to repeat themselves patiently. But the adaptations were informal, personal, not systematic. The military did not restructure operations to accommodate hearing loss, because hearing loss was nearly universal, and accommodating it would have meant acknowledging that the entire army was damaged in ways that could not be repaired. Losing your hearing became normal. The practices that became normal in World War I were not the practices that appeared in official histories, in government reports, in patriotic speeches. They were the practices that allowed the war to continue when it should have been unendurable. They were the adaptations that human beings made when confronted with industrial-scale death over a period of years. Adaptations that would have been unthinkable in August 1914, but were simply routine by November 1918. The soldiers who lived through this war and returned home carried these norms with them, carried the knowledge of what had become normal, what they had done and witnessed and accepted. Most of them did not talk about it, not to families, not to journalists, not to historians. They talked to each other, in veterans organizations, in private moments, in coded language that civilians did not understand. The war had changed them in ways that could not be explained to people who had not been there, had normalized behaviors and experiences that sounded like exaggerations or lies when spoken aloud. So they remained largely silent, and the official memory of the war was constructed around what could be comfortably discussed: the battles and strategies, the political causes, the broad sweep of events. The smaller truths, the daily truths, the normalized horrors were set aside, not denied exactly, but not examined. World War I killed approximately 20 million people and wounded 20 million more, but those numbers do not capture what happened to the survivors, to the men who lived through years of conditions that should have killed them, who adapted to those conditions by changing what they considered normal, who returned to civilian life carrying the knowledge that civilization was far thinner than anyone had believed, that it could be stripped away in months, that underneath the laws and customs and moral frameworks that govern human behavior in peacetime, there existed a capacity for endurance that was almost infinite and almost inhuman. The war ended in November 1918, but what had become normal during those 4 years did not end, could not end, would never entirely end. It remained in the memories of the men who survived, in the institutions that had adapted to manage industrial slaughter, in the precedents that had been set for how modern nations wage total war. The disturbing practices of World War I became the template, the baseline, the new standard against which future horrors would be measured and found, inevitably, to be normal.